A very scary thought. We know how much any changes can make a difference for us here in SA when the US economy or the Asian economies do something drastic. Well, I'm afraid the US economy is heading for a recession in 2023. The US Fed Reserve has constantly hiked interest rates this year to try and control inflation. Now, of course, this all sounds familiar, I'm sure, because you would have heard our own finance minister talking about controlling inflation. So what's the knock-on effect for developing countries like ours? Always good to have senior policy analyst at the Centre for Risk Analysis, Chris Hattingh, making time for us this morning. Chris, good to have you back on eNCA. It's been a whole minute. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this. So first of all, let's answer the question I was posing. 2023, we're told the US will be in a recession. Some are arguing they are there already. What do you make of it?
Good morning, Gareth and Tumelo. Thank you for the opportunity. Yes, when things go badly in the US, when we have high inflation, it means maybe some of us can't afford that Twitter verification. So it affects us in many different ways. But of course, for the majority of South Africans, it's going to affect them in terms of food prices, fuel prices, that sort of thing. In terms of the US recession, I think it's a very high probability that they will enter recession next year. The same with the UK. Indeed, the Bank of England thinks that their recession will last until mid-2024. So when we have global economic activity tightening, that means less goods and services moving around and less demand for South African commodities. So the Eurozone and China, of course, South Africa's two biggest export markets in terms of raw materials and commodities. If those two areas experience less economic activity, less economic growth, less transactions happening, higher interest rates, it means that our own exporters, our miners, our farmers, warehousing, manufacturing, all of that suffers down the line, which in turn means less economic activity here in South Africa and possibly fewer job opportunities as well.
Because I see as well, when you talk about risk, anytime there's any sort of borrowing involved, that's considered a financial and economic risk as well. And the Fed's actions of raised borrowing costs, it's been the fastest in decades now. I mean, you have to go back to, some would argue, the early 80s, possibly even the late 70s, to see this kind of risk borrowing.
Yes, absolutely. And for the last 30, 20 years, we've enjoyed easy credit, easy money, where central banks around the world loosened financial conditions that pumped more liquidity into markets. Of course, during COVID-19 and the lockdowns, a lot of more developed economies tried to support their citizens through stimulus packages and that sort of thing. But unfortunately, those debts come good at some point. You have to pay back that debt that you took on, as well as the interest on that debt. So if you're a more stable, developed economy, maybe the risk profile on your debt is less, but you still have to pay back that debt, which is partly now why the US Fed is tightening monetary conditions to try and dampen economic activity, to try and bring back some of those dollars that they pumped into the economy. And then for countries like South Africa with higher risk profiles, if we take on more debt, that exposes us more to repaying that on the line, especially when, for example, the currency weakens or when we have less economic activity. So it was good to see in the latest budget, of course, how a government is doing relatively well with stabilizing the debt, but I don't think we're out of the woods just yet.
No, certainly not as well. I don't think we can see the light for the woods, and certainly not the leaves and trees for the woods right now as well. And Chris, when we talk about knee-jerk reactions, a lot of criticism being leveled at the Fed chair, Jay Powell, of course. If we go back 2020, criticized heavily for not doing enough to try and stave off the inflation. Now he's being accused of a knee-jerk reaction and now trying to act too fast. So the big financial butterfly flapping its wings too quickly and too loud, and we're having to pay for the lack of policy changes about 3-4 years ago.
Yes, and I think a big part of the criticism is around the language that was used over the last 2 to 3 years about inflation being transitory, for example. And a lot of economists saw inflation coming down the line again by pumping in a lot of stimulus into the economy, and with economies in lockdown, you were always going to see inflation coming down in about 4 or 5 years' time, which we're seeing, which is where we are at the present moment. So the Fed, I think, trying to catch up where it should have maybe started its rate increase cycle earlier, which the South African Reserve Bank, I think, has done very well at, sort of getting ahead of the curve in that regard, which is why we see in the South African context, monetary policy still doing relatively well in terms of protecting some of the value of the rand. Now, there are many supply side issues that the South African economy faces. Those problems aren't solved by good monetary policy. They can be helped and somewhat mitigated, but the Reserve Bank, I think, is doing as much as it can to try and balance the sort of difficulty between what the Fed and other central banks are doing versus what the South African economy needs in the long run.
And just as I say goodbye to you, Chris, for the moment, because we know how much people are going to be watching our economy going into 2023 as well. There really isn't much that the SARB can do as far as raising interest rates are concerned. We almost have to follow the tail of the dog at the moment. We have to react. We can't offset this.
No, absolutely. But you see other government departments, maybe cabinet even, can support the Reserve Bank in terms of what it's trying to do in terms of policy reform. So, for example, if we had more reliable electricity supply, if the ports were more efficient, if we had better manufacturing capacity, we wouldn't be so exposed to imported inflation. So when things happen in the US or the UK, of course, we're connected in a global economy. But if we had our own manufacturing base, some better trade infrastructure, then we would see more economic activity here and a less exposure to that imported inflation and administered costs. So we could definitely do much more to mitigate some of those risks. But unfortunately, at the moment, the Reserve Bank is a bit of a lightning rod for the inflation battle, as it were.
Yeah, the conduit of inflation, unfortunately. But you made some very good points. You've opened a can of worms for me there as well, where we can try and take this conversation next as far as import and export exposure to the markets. Chris, always good having you on the show. Hope to hear from you soon again. Senior Policy Analyst at the Centre for Risk Analysis. Chris Hattingh painting, unfortunately, a bit of a bleak picture if the US were to go into a recession, how that knock-on effect could knock very, very hard. 25 away.